What is loyalty? Is it a promise, a duty, or is it something deeper? A silent language spoken only by the heart, a bond forged in fire and faith that time cannot break and distance cannot sever. For Sergeant Ethan Hayes, loyalty was the quiet weight of a 90-pound German shepherd leaning against his leg in the heart of a war zone. For his K-9 partner, Rex, loyalty was the scent of one man, his entire world. They were separated by war, by injury, by miles of cold bureaucracy. Ethan thought he'd lost that part of his soul forever. He was wrong. What he found years later will challenge everything you think you know about hope. And what happened next will break you. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see this community come together. If you enjoy powerful stories, subscribe and hit the bell. Now let's dive in. The air in Leadville, Colorado was thin and sharp, a stark contrast to the thick, dust-choked air of Kandahar that still clung to Ethan's memories. 3 years had passed since the IED, since the world had gone white, then red, then black. 3 years since he'd last felt the familiar grounding pressure of Rex's head on his lap. His honorable medical discharge came with a medal for valor, a pension, and a case of PTSD so severe that the world felt like it was wrapped in gauze. Sounds were too loud, open spaces too threatening, sleep a minefield of recurring nightmares. He bought a small, isolated cabin nestled deep in the Pike San Isabel National Forest. His only neighbors were aspen trees and the ghosts of his past. Life was a monotonous loop. Wake up before dawn, the sweat already cool on his skin, brew coffee that tasted like ash, stare out the window at the stoic, unmoving mountains. Sometimes he'd work on the cabin, fixing a loose board or chopping wood, the physical exertion a temporary anesthetic for the buzzing in his skull. He spoke to no one. The town grocer knew him only as the quiet man with haunted eyes who came in every 2 weeks, paid in cash, and never made eye contact. He had tried to get Rex. Oh God, he had tried. From his hospital bed in Landstuhl, Germany, he'd filled out every form, made every call. He was Rex's handler. By every military custom, he had first rights to adopt his partner upon the dog's retirement. But bureaucracy is a beast with no heart. Rex, they said, was still a valuable asset. He was reassigned. Then a year later, another letter, colder and more final than the first. Rex had been adopted out through a civilian program. An address was redacted. The case was closed. The news had been a second explosion, one that left no visible shrapnel but shattered something deep inside him. He had failed his partner. In the quiet of his cabin, that failure was a constant, suffocating presence. He would sometimes find himself murmuring old commands into the empty air. Wacha, he'd whisper. Watch, such, seek, bleeb, stay. But no one was there to listen. One crisp October afternoon, necessity drove him into town. The first snow of the season was predicted, a big one, and he needed supplies to be fully snowed in. As he loaded bags of rice, canned goods, and a new axe handle into his old pickup truck, a flicker of movement behind the diner caught his eye. It was a stray, a German shepherd, impossibly thin, its once proud coat a mess of matted fur and mud. Its ribs were a terrifying accordion under its skin. The dog was nosing through a tipped-over trash can, desperate, its movements slow and pained. People walked by, casting glances of pity or disgust, but no one stopped. Ethan's heart, a numb and calloused thing, gave a painful lurch. He'd seen 1,000 strays in Afghanistan, but this was different. This was here. This felt personal. He grabbed the jerky he'd bought for himself and walked slowly toward the alley. Easy there, buddy, he said softly, his voice rough from disuse. The dog flinched, its head low, a low growl rumbling in its chest. It was a look of fear, not aggression. It was the look of an animal that had known only cruelty from the hands of men. Ethan stopped, about 15 feet away. He knelt down, making himself smaller. He didn't look the dog in the eye, a sign of respect, of non-aggression. He just looked at the distinct black saddle marking on its back, the elegant slope of its head. There was a familiarity there that made his breath catch in his throat. A small white patch of fur on its chest, just like, no, it couldn't be, it was impossible. A cruel trick of his grief-addled mind. Still, his training took over. He spoke, not in English, but in the language they had shared, the language of their bond. His voice was barely a whisper, carried on the thin mountain air. Rex Platz, lie down. The stray's head shot up, The growl died in its throat, replaced by a confused whine. Its ears, once pinned back in fear, twitched and swiveled forward, trying to place the sound, the word that resonated in a deep, dormant part of its memory. Its amber eyes, cloudy with hunger and despair, stared at Ethan, truly seeing him for the first time. Ethan's heart was hammering against his ribs. He had to be sure. He cleared his throat, his voice a little stronger, a little more certain. "Rex, bye fuss, heel." And then it happened. The dog took a hesitant step, then another. The broken, shambling gait of a starving stray began to morph, to straighten. The muscle memory, buried under layers of pain and neglect, kicked in. The dog's spine aligned. Its head came up. It limped toward Ethan, not as a beggar, but as a soldier answering a command. It stopped precisely at Ethan's left side, its shoulder brushing against his knee. It sat, its gaze fixed on his face, and let out a soft, questioning whimper. A single tear traced a path through the grime on Ethan's cheek and dripped onto the dog's matted head. He reached out a trembling hand, not to the dog's head, but to the spot just behind its ear, the way he always had. The fur was rough and dirty, but underneath, it was him. It was his Rex. "Bleeb," Ethan whispered, his voice cracking with 1,000 emotions. "Stay. You're home, buddy. I've got you. You're staying with me." Rex leaned his full weight against Ethan's leg, a silent confirmation. A promise kept. In the middle of a dusty alley, surrounded by the indifference of the world, two broken soldiers had just found their way back to each other. The first few weeks were a delicate dance of healing. The vet in the next town over, a kind woman with gentle hands, had been horrified by Rex's condition. Severe malnutrition, a partially healed fracture in his back leg that hadn't set right, and a deep, infected gash on his shoulder, hidden beneath the matted fur. "He's been through hell, Sergeant," she'd said, reading the name on Ethan's old military ID. Someone did this to him. The words ignited a cold, protective fury in Ethan. Someone had taken his hero, his partner, and tried to break him. Slowly, carefully, Ethan nursed Rex back to health. He cooked chicken and rice, feeding him small amounts every few hours. He cleaned the wound on his shoulder with a tenderness he didn't know he still possessed. He'd sit on the floor for hours, just being present, letting Rex rediscover the safety of his presence. And as Rex's body began to heal, so did Ethan's soul. The silence of the cabin was no longer empty. It was filled with the soft padding of paws, the gentle thump of a tail against the wooden floor, the contented sighs of a sleeping dog. The nightmares began to recede. When he woke up, heart pounding from a memory of explosions, a wet nose would nudge his hand in the dark, and the terror would subside. Rex was his anchor, his living, breathing proof that he had survived. By the time the first heavy snows began to fall in late November, Rex was a different animal. His coat was thick and glossy, his eyes bright and alert. The limp was still there, a permanent reminder of his journey, but he moved with a renewed purpose. He was, once again, the proud dog Ethan remembered. Their new routine was the highlight of Ethan's existence. Every morning they would patrol the vast wilderness behind the cabin. It wasn't a walk, it was a patrol. Ethan would carry a pack with supplies, and Rex would range ahead, his nose to the ground, his ears constantly scanning their surroundings. The old instincts, both his and Rex's, were resurfacing. The soldier and his K9 were back on duty. It was on one of these patrols, deep in a part of the forest where the trees grew thick and ancient, that Rex's demeanor changed. He stopped dead, one paw lifted, his body rigid. A low, almost inaudible growl rumbled from his chest. It wasn't the sound of him spotting a squirrel or a deer. It was his work growl, his IED growl. "What is it, boy?" Ethan whispered, his own senses going on high alert. Rex didn't move. His gaze was fixed on a dense thicket of pines about 50 yards away. Ethan scanned the area, his eyes tracing every shadow. He saw nothing, heard nothing but the wind sighing through the branches. But he trusted his partner. He trusted him with his life. He always had. They circled around, using the terrain for cover, just as they had been trained to do. As they came upwind of the thicket, a smell hit Ethan's nostrils. Acrid smoke, cured meat, and something else. Something metallic and wrong. Peering through the branches, Ethan's blood ran cold. It was a poacher's camp, a crude, illegal setup. Several steel jaw traps lay on the ground, one of them stained with blood. A wire cage held two terrified, whimpering fox kits. And hanging from a tree branch was the carcass of a massive bull elk, its magnificent head sawed off for a trophy. Rage, pure and white-hot, surged through Ethan. This was a desecration, a violation of the wild, sacred place that had given him sanctuary. Before he could decide what to do, a voice cut through the air, rough and grating. "Got anything, Jake?" A second man, younger, emerged from a makeshift lean-to. Nothing. This storm spooked them all. The first man, a burly figure with a cruel face and a greasy beard, spat on the ground. "Don't matter. We got the big fella. That rack'll fetch us enough to last the winter. Let's pack up before the snow gets too deep." Ethan backed away slowly, his hand resting on Rex's head to keep him quiet. He had to get back. He had to call the Forest Service, the sheriff. These men were not just poachers. They were callous and dangerous. They made it back to the cabin just as the sky turned a bruised purple and the snow began to fall in thick, wet flakes. The forecast hadn't lied. This was the big one. Within an hour, the world outside was a swirling vortex of white. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, rattling the window panes. Ethan stoked the fire in the wood stove, the crackling flames a small comfort against the storm's fury. Rex lay at his feet, but he wasn't settled. He was on edge, his ears twitching at every gust of wind, his eyes fixed on the door. "It's okay, buddy," Ethan said, scratching the dog's neck. "We're safe in here." But Rex knew better. An hour later, a heavy, insistent pounding on the door made them both jump. It wasn't the sound of a lost hiker. It was aggressive, demanding. Ethan grabbed the heavy, cast-iron poker from beside the stove. He moved to the side of the door, out of sight from the small peephole. "Who is it?" he yelled over the wind. "Just looking for some shelter from the storm." It was the poacher's voice, the older one. "Our truck's stuck down the ridge. We saw your smoke." Ethan's mind raced. They had seen his smoke. They had followed it. They knew he was here. He thought back to the dead elk, the trapped kits. These weren't men you invited into your home. "Sorry," Ethan shouted back, his voice hard. "I don't have room. Keep heading north. There's a ranger station about 5 miles out." He was lying. The station was 15 miles away and impassable in this storm. There was a pause. The wind howled. Then the voice came again, colder this time, stripped of its false friendliness. "That ain't a very neighborly answer. I suggest you open the door, now." Ethan heard the distinct metallic click of a rifle's safety being disengaged. Rex was on his feet now, a furious barrage of barks erupting from his chest. He stood between Ethan and the door, a black and tan wall of protective fury. "You've got a dog in there," the man snarled. "You'd better shut him up." The conflict was no longer in the abstract. It was on his doorstep. The war he had tried to escape had followed him home. The poachers weren't just looking for shelter. They had likely seen his tracks leading from their camp. They saw him as a witness. And in the middle of a blizzard, miles from anyone, witnesses had a way of disappearing. He was trapped, outnumbered. And the only ally he had was the dog the world had thrown away. The storm raged outside. Inside, a different, more deadly storm was about to break. The poacher's voice, laced with menace, cut through the door again. "I'm not asking again, old man. Open this door or I'm making a new one." A loud thud vibrated through the cabin as a heavy boot slammed against the wood. Rex's barking intensified, a deep, guttural sound of pure aggression. For a moment, Ethan was paralyzed. The sound of the impact, the angry shouting, it threw him back to Kandahar. The chaos of a breached compound, the smell of cordite, the screams. His breath hitched, his vision narrowed. The walls of the cabin felt like they were closing in. The PTSD was a physical entity, a cold hand gripping his heart, telling him to freeze, to collapse. Then he felt a wet nose press firmly into his trembling hand. He looked down. Rex had momentarily stopped barking, looking up at him, his amber eyes clear and focused. It was the same look he'd given him moments before finding an IED that would have vaporized their entire platoon. It was a look that said, "I'm here. We're here. What's the mission, boss?" That look cut through the fog of his panic like a searchlight. This wasn't Kandahar. He wasn't a broken soldier hiding from the world. He was a man in his home, protecting his family. And his family was a 90-pound German shepherd who had already been through hell. He would not let the monsters win, not again. "Never!" Ethan roared, his voice filled with a strength he hadn't felt in years. "You are not getting in here!" The decision was made. The internal switch was flipped. He was no longer Sergeant Hayes. the PTSD patient. He was Sergeant Hayes, K-9 handler, and his duty was to protect his partner. "All right, have it your way," the poacher Silas screamed from outside. Another massive kick hit the door, splintering the frame. It wouldn't hold for long. Ethan moved with a speed and purpose that had lain dormant for 3 years. His military training, buried under layers of trauma, came flooding back. He was clear-headed, focused. "Okay, Rex, Waka," he commanded. "Watch." Rex immediately fell silent and took up a position by the door, low to the ground, a coiled spring of muscle and teeth. Ethan scanned the cabin. It was his terrain. He knew every inch of it. The main door was the primary breach point. The windows were the secondary. The back door was old and weak. He raced to the back door, ramming a heavy wooden chest against it. He dragged his solid oak dining table and flipped it on its side in the middle of the room, creating a piece of solid cover. He grabbed the new axe handle from his supply bag. It felt heavy and solid in his hands. It wasn't a rifle, but it would do. Crack! A window in the living room shattered, and a blast of frigid, snow-filled air flooded the cabin. The younger poacher, Jake, was trying to climb through. Before Ethan could move, Rex exploded into action. He launched himself at the window, not at the man, but at the space just below him, barking with such ferocity that Jake scrambled backward, falling into the snowdrift outside. "Damn it, Silas the dog!" Jake yelled. "Shoot the damn thing!" Silas bellowed. Ethan knew he had seconds. He couldn't defend 2 fronts at once. He had to force the fight. He looked at the wood stove, a roaring fire blazing within. He looked at the shattered window. An idea, desperate and dangerous, formed in his mind. It was a turning point, a commitment to a path from which there was no return. He was no longer just defending. He was attacking. He grabbed the heavy fire tongs and opened the searing hot door of the stove. The heat washed over his face. He pulled out a large, glowing red log of oak, sparks cascading onto the floor. "Pass off!" he yelled to Rex. "Pay attention!" With a primal roar, Ethan hurled the burning log through the shattered window. It landed in the snowdrift right where Jake had fallen. The snow hissed and vaporized. Jake screamed, more in shock than pain, as he scrambled away from the intense heat. It was a declaration of war. He had used fire. He had escalated the fight beyond a simple siege. Now there would be no negotiation. There would be no retreat. One way or another, this would end tonight, in this cabin, in the heart of the storm. He stood behind his makeshift barricade, axe handle gripped tight, his partner at his side. The fear was gone, replaced by an ice-cold resolve. They had awakened the soldier. They would regret it. The burning log had bought him time, but it had also enraged them. The assault on the main door began in earnest. The heavy thuds of a makeshift battering ram, likely a log from his own woodpile, crashed against the door, each impact a death knell. "We're coming in, you crazy bastard!" Silas roared, his voice thick with fury. "And I'm gonna skin that mutt of yours myself!" Ethan's knuckles were white on the axe handle. Every fiber of his being screamed to meet them head-on, but his training held him in check. Control the engagement. Let them come to you. He glanced at Rex. The dog was a statue of lethal patience, his eyes locked on the groaning door, his body trembling with contained energy. He was ready. Crack! With a final sickening groan, the door jamb splintered and the door flew inward, crashing to the floor. For a heartbeat, there was silence, broken only by the howling wind. Then, a figure filled the doorway. It was Silas, the big poacher, holding a hunting rifle, his eyes wild and crazed. Behind him, Jake hesitated, his face pale with fear. "Now," Silas growled, leveling the rifle. "It's over." He didn't account for the table. As he took a step forward, his leg hit the barricade, and he stumbled. It was the opening Ethan needed. He vaulted over the table, not at Silas, but to the side, using the man's momentum against him. He swung the axe handle in a low, hard arc, connecting solidly with Silas's knee. The man howled in pain and rage, his leg buckling. The rifle fired, the shot going wild, blasting a hole in the ceiling and showering them with plaster and splinters. The sound was deafening in the small cabin, a brutal echo of the IED. Ethan's PTSD flared, just for a second, the ringing in his ears, the smell of gunpowder. But the sight of Rex held him steady. Jake, seeing his partner go down, finally broke. "Silas, let's just go. This is insane." "Shut up, you coward!" Silas shrieked, trying to bring the rifle back around. He was on one knee, but he was still dangerous. Ethan knew he had to close the distance. He lunged forward, but Silas was faster than he looked. He dropped the rifle and drew a long, wicked-looking skinning knife from his belt. He slashed wildly, forcing Ethan to backpedal. It was in that moment that Jake made his choice. He turned and fled out the broken door, disappearing into the white chaos of the blizzard. He wanted no more part of this. It was one-on-one, or so Silas thought. As Ethan dodged another vicious swipe of the knife, he felt Rex move behind him, a blur of black and tan. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He was silent, a weapon system being deployed. Silas, his focus entirely on Ethan, never saw it coming. Rex launched himself, not at the knife arm, but at the man's center of mass, hitting him square in the chest with the force of a freight train. The two of them went down in a tangled heap, Silas's head hitting the stone hearth with a sickening thud. The knife clattered across the floor. Ethan scrambled over, ready to secure the man, but Silas was already rolling, pushing Rex off him. He was dazed but full of fight. He got to his hands and knees, grabbing for the fallen knife. Rex, recovering instantly, repositioned himself between the man and the weapon. He stood his ground, a deep, final, warning growl rumbling in his chest. Silas looked at the dog, his face a mask of hatred. He saw his knife just inches from his hand. He saw Ethan, readying the axe handle for a final blow. His eyes darted between them, calculating. Then, with a guttural scream of pure malice, he didn't lunge for the knife. He lunged for the rifle he had dropped near the doorway. It all happened in a split second. "Rex, no!" Ethan screamed. But Rex was already moving. He knew the rifle was the greater threat. As Silas's fingers wrapped around the stock of the gun, Rex threw himself forward, sinking his teeth deep into the man's arm. Silas roared in agony and twisted, bringing the heavy rifle butt around in a brutal, desperate arc. It connected with Rex's side with a horrifying, wet crunch. Rex yelped, a sharp, piercing cry of pain that shattered Ethan's soul. The dog's jaw loosened, and he was thrown across the room, slamming into the wall before collapsing into a heap. He lay still, a shallow, ragged breath escaping his lips. Something inside Ethan broke. The calm, controlled soldier vanished, replaced by a primal, vengeful fury. He let out a wordless roar and charged. He didn't need the axe handle. Silas, his arm bleeding freely from the dog bite, was trying to aim the rifle, but he was too slow. Ethan crashed into him, driving him backward through the broken doorway and into the raging snowstorm. They fell into a deep drift, fists flying. Ethan was a machine, fueled by adrenaline and a grief so profound it felt like insanity. He landed blow after blow, the cold of the snow on his knuckles the only thing he could feel. He didn't stop until Silas's body went limp beneath him, unconscious. Ethan stumbled back to his feet, gasping in the freezing air. The wind whipped around him, but he didn't feel the cold. He turned and staggered back into the cabin, his eyes searching for only one thing. Rex. He had not moved. He lay in a crumpled heap on the floor, his breathing shallow. A dark crimson stain was spreading slowly across the wooden planks beneath him. Ethan fell to his knees beside his partner. "No, no, no," he whispered, his hands hovering over the dog's body, afraid to touch him, afraid of what he might find. "Rex. Hey, buddy, look at me." The dog's eyes fluttered open, clouded with pain. He let out a faint whine and tried to lift his head, but couldn't. He just managed a weak thump of his tail against the floor. One last time. "You saved me," Ethan sobbed, tears freezing on his cheeks as he gently stroked Rex's head. "You saved me, you magnificent, beautiful boy. Just hold on. Please, just hold on." The storm raged. The poacher lay unconscious in the snow. And inside the broken cabin, a decorated soldier held his dying partner, his heart, for the second time in his life, being ripped out of his chest. The world outside the cabin was a maelstrom of white noise and icy fury, but inside, there was only the sound of Ethan's ragged breathing and the shallow, hitching breaths of his best friend. He carefully tore strips from a clean bedsheet, pressing them gently against the wound on Rex's side, trying to staunch the bleeding. The dog's ribs were clearly broken. The blow from the rifle butt had been devastating. "Stay with me, Rex," Ethan pleaded, his voice a raw whisper. "Stay." He wrapped Rex in every blanket he could find, his own survival an afterthought. His entire universe had contracted to this single, vital point, the flickering life of the dog in his arms. He dragged the unconscious Silas back inside, not out of compassion, but pragmatism. He couldn't let the man freeze to death. He had to answer for what he'd done. He bound the poacher's hands and feet with duct tape and left him by the cold back wall. For the rest of the night, Ethan sat on the floor, holding his partner, talking to him, recounting their stories. He spoke of the blistering heat of the Afghan sun, the loyalty of their platoon, the time Rex found a hidden weapons cache with nothing but a scent on the wind. He was making a promise, not just to Rex, but to himself. If they survived this, their story wouldn't end in silence. The storm broke with the dawn. The wind died down, leaving an eerie, muffled silence. The world was buried under 4 feet of pristine, unforgiving snow. There was no way out, no cell service. But Ethan Hayes was a soldier, and soldiers never give up. He found the poacher's satellite phone in Silas's jacket pocket. The battery was almost dead, but there was a flicker of life. He carried it to the highest point of his roof, his boots sinking deep in the snow, and after what felt like an eternity, he got a signal. 1 bar. His call was short, professional, his voice stripped of all emotion but urgency. "This is Sergeant Ethan Hayes at coordinates 4, 0.1, 6 north, 106.3, 1 west. I am a retired veteran. I have an injured civilian in my custody, suspect in an assault. My military K-9 is critically injured. Repeat, critically injured. I require immediate medical evac for my partner." It took 8 hours. 8 hours of Ethan monitoring Rex's breathing, melting snow for him to drink, and whispering promises into his fur. Finally, he heard it, the distant rhythmic whump, whump, whump of a helicopter. A National Guard search and rescue team dispatched because of the severity of the call rappelled down from the chopper. They took Silas into custody. The younger poacher, Jake, had been picked up on the main road suffering from frostbite and had confessed everything. But Ethan only had eyes for the medic working on Rex. The medic, a young woman with kind, competent eyes, administered a shot of morphine and carefully stabilized Rex on a small backboard. "He's tough, Sergeant," she said, looking at Ethan with profound respect. "He's a fighter." "He's a hero," Ethan corrected her, his voice choked with emotion. They airlifted them to a specialized veterinary trauma center in Denver. The hours that followed were the longest of Ethan's life. He sat in the sterile waiting room, the blood of his friend and his enemy still on his clothes, refusing to leave. He just stared at the wall, the entire siege, the entire journey, playing over and over in his mind. Finally, the vet, a gray-haired man with the weary look of someone who had seen too much, came out. "Sergeant Hayes," he began, and Ethan's heart stopped. "He has 2 broken ribs, one of which punctured his spleen, causing massive internal bleeding," the vet said, his tone grave. "Frankly, I have no idea how he was still conscious when you found him. The blood loss, the shock. He shouldn't have survived the night." Ethan braced himself for the words he couldn't bear to hear. "But he did," the vet continued, a small smile touching his lips. "We repaired the spleen, set the ribs. He's one of the strongest dogs I have ever seen. His will to live, it's astonishing. He's not out of the woods, but he's stable. He's resting. You can see him." The relief was so absolute, so overwhelming that Ethan's legs gave out. He had to grab the wall to steady himself. Tears streamed down his face, not of grief but of profound gut-wrenching gratitude. Rex's recovery was slow but steady. Ethan never left his side. He slept on a cot in the clinic for the first week, and as Rex healed, something miraculous happened. The ghosts in Ethan's mind began to fade. The rage that had fueled him during the fight subsided, replaced by a quiet, fierce love. The hole in his soul, the one left by the war and the years of separation, was being filled, stitch by painful stitch, by the unwavering loyalty of the dog who refused to leave him. Months later, with Rex now sporting a noble scar on his side and his limp a little more pronounced, they stood on a sun-drenched mountain peak. Rex leaned against Ethan's leg, his familiar grounding weight a comfort beyond words. The world was no longer a threat. It was just a place. Their place. Ethan had testified at Silas's trial. The man was sentenced to a long prison term for poaching, assault with a deadly weapon, and a dozen other charges. Ethan had also started talking to a therapist, finally able to voice the horrors he'd seen because he no longer had to face them alone. One afternoon, a letter arrived. It was from a local search and rescue organization. They had heard his story. They were looking for a new K-9 team. They knew he was a decorated handler, and they had heard about the legendary dog who had taken on a poacher to save his partner. Ethan looked down at Rex, who looked back up at him, his tail giving a gentle thump. Their old mission, war. was over. But a new one was just beginning. They would take their bond, forged in the deserts of Afghanistan and reforged in the snows of Colorado, and use it to bring others home, to save the lost, to be a beacon of hope in the wilderness. Ethan knelt and wrapped his arms around his friend's neck, burying his face in his fur. "What do you say, buddy?" he whispered. "One more tour?" Rex responded by licking the lingering salt of old tears from his master's face. It was all the answer he needed. The soldier and his K9 were no longer hiding from the world. They were back on watch, together, whole, and finally, at peace. The bond between a soldier and their K9 partner is forged in the most extreme conditions imaginable. It's a testament to the fact that the deepest wounds can often be healed by the purest loyalty. Ethan and Rex's story isn't just about survival. It's a story of redemption. It's a reminder that even after the darkest storm, the sun will rise again. And that true heroism is often found in the quiet, unwavering love of a friend who refuses to let you go. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to see it. Let it be a reminder to look out for one another, and for the animals who give us their unconditional love without ever asking for anything in return. Like this video and subscribe for more stories that matter. And in the comments below, we'd love for you to tell us about an animal who changed your life. Because every story of kindness and loyalty deserves to be told. Thank you for watching.